Indigenous procurement scandal was the biggest scandal we've seen yet. And I think Canadians saw today why. We had a senior Liberal cabinet minister from Alberta with multiple different areas of responsibility, the member for Edmonton Centre, leaving cabinet because of the Liberals' Indigenous procurement scandal. Now, members across the way think this is funny. It's not funny. The Assembly of First Nations has told committee that a majority of the contracts that are supposed to be going to Indigenous entrepreneurs supporting economic development in Indigenous communities, the majority of those contracts are going to shell companies. It has been Indigenous leaders repeatedly testifying at committee that we're seeing rampant abuse in a program that's supposed to benefit Indigenous entrepreneurs and communities. That you have people pretending to be Indigenous, you have shell companies, you have abuses of joint ventures where virtually all of the benefit goes to a non-Indigenous company. So this is the abuse we've been seeing. We've been talking about this for months. But it has just recently come out that a company owned by the Minister of Employment, the former Minister of Employment who just resigned, a company that he owned was pretending to be Indigenous in order to try to get government contracts. So not only are we seeing rampant abuse of this program, people who are not Indigenous pretending to be Indigenous or trying to take advantage of the program in other ways, but we have a member of the Liberal caucus, a former Minister of the Crown himself, owning a company that pretended to be Indigenous owned when it was owned by a Minister of the Crown who is not Indigenous. This minister repeatedly misrepresented himself. The Liberal Party in its public statements identified him as Indigenous, said he was part of the Liberals' Indigenous caucus. Every other member of that caucus, they still identify as Indigenous, but he acknowledges that he's not, even though he was a member of the Liberal Indigenous caucus. And we can see repeatedly in various situations how he falsely represented himself as being Indigenous, and that this was part of a political story he wanted to tell, but this also was the basis on which the company he owned pretended to be an Indigenous-owned company and tried to get contracts on that basis. Now, his company is not the only instance of abuse. Again, we have the AFN saying a majority of those getting these contracts. We have companies like Dalian Enterprise, the Canadian healthcare agency, that got over $100 million each, where there, I think, very clearly are abuses of joint ventures. And these are companies that were taken off the Indigenous business list, but nonetheless profited significantly while they were on it. Madam Speaker, this is disgusting. This is absolutely disgusting. Indigenous peoples in this country are experiencing unacceptable levels of poverty. And we had a government that came in with high words about reconciliation. And here we are. Here we are today. After 9 years, they came in promising reconciliation. And 9 years later, you have a minister of this government leaving cabinet because he pretended to be Indigenous, and he used that pretense to try to advance the commercial interests of his own private company getting contracts from the government. And this government defended him for far too long. He remains a member of the government caucus, and his company remains eligible for government contracts. So will the Liberals show some contrition tonight and recognize how badly they failed on reconciliation?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Indigenous Services.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. I thank the member for this opportunity to talk about the importance of economic reconciliation through supporting Indigenous businesses. Madam Speaker, I think it's important to take a step back to remind members why the procurement strategy for Indigenous businesses was created in the first place. Indigenous peoples in Canada comprise approximately 5% of the overall population, yet historically businesses owned by First Nations, Inuit, and Métis entrepreneurs were consistently winning a lower percentage of federal contracts. In the early 90s, the government saw an opportunity to facilitate Indigenous people's access to procurement opportunities. In 1995, the eligibility criteria for the current procurement strategy for Indigenous businesses, then under a slightly different name, was approved. Based on engagements with Indigenous organizations and business leaders, in 2021, Public Service and Procurement Canada, in collaboration with the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat and Indigenous Services Canada, created more opportunities by implementing the mandatory minimum 5% Indigenous procurement target. Today, the procurement strategy for Indigenous businesses and the mandatory 5% target continue to be two important ways that the Government of Canada supports Indigenous businesses, including Indigenous entrepreneurs across the country. And we have heard many times from Indigenous partners how important this PSIB is for advancing economic reconciliation and supporting Indigenous businesses and entrepreneurs. Since we announced the 5% target, we have seen a surge in Indigenous entrepreneurs' interest and investment in the program. In contrast, the proportion of contracts going to Indigenous businesses in the Harper years never went above 1%. And now they're trying to undermine this critical program by focusing on the extremely rare instances of bad actors that do not represent the overall merit of the procurement strategy. Investing in Indigenous communities and building up Indigenous businesses and entrepreneurs benefits all Canadians. According to the 2022 National Indigenous Economic Strategy for Canada, the continued exclusion of Indigenous peoples costs the Canadian economy $27.7 billion every year. The National Indigenous Economic Development Board found that closing the existing employment gap could help lift over 150,000 Indigenous peoples out of poverty. There is a real cost to inaction. I'd like to be clear, Madam Speaker, we're working closely with Indigenous partners to improve the Indigenous procurement process and address these concerns. Together with Indigenous partners, we're gathering information and building the foundation for a co-developed transformative Indigenous procurement strategy which supports economic reconciliation. One of the components of this co-developed strategy is the transfer of the Indigenous Business Directory to Indigenous partners. We know that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis are best positioned to define and verify Indigenous businesses. We will continue to work with Indigenous partners to co-develop a path forward that strengthens economic relationships with Indigenous entrepreneurs and businesses. These increased economic opportunities for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples are vital to ensuring continued growth and prosperity for all of Canada. We'll continue to improve and support the program as it's vital for supporting Indigenous businesses and communities, and I hope that our Conservative colleagues will support us in doing that.
Member for Sherwood Park versus Saskatchewan.
Madam Speaker, it's really unbelievable that the government persists in their arrogant pretense that everything is totally fine. The member didn't at all mention the fact that today a minister of the Crown left cabinet because his company was trying to abuse this program. She said extremely rare instances of bad actors. That's completely the opposite of what we were told by the Assembly of First Nations, by many other Indigenous leaders. So the government isn't listening because Indigenous leaders are telling us that abuses are rampant in this program, that there are companies that have gotten hundreds of millions of dollars through abuses who are not Indigenous benefiting from this. You have a member of the Liberal caucus who is a bad actor in this whole process. Again, will the government show some humility and stop pretending everything's fine, listen to Indigenous leaders, and actually recognize that there's a big problem?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, I'll be happy to go into more detail about what happens in those rare occurrences where concerns with supplier integrity is suspected. If a department or agency has concerns about supplier integrity or misconduct at any point in a procurement process, they can refer the matter to Public Services and Procurement Canada's Office of Supplier Integrity and Compliance. The office administers the strengthened ineligibility and suspension policy, which came into effect earlier this year. This policy sets out the circumstances and processes that enable the Registrar of Ineligibility and Suspension to suspend and debar suppliers. This includes suppliers who have been charged with or convicted of a specific offense or have been found to lack business integrity or business honesty in a manner that directly affects their present responsibility. On this side of the House, Madam Speaker, we will continue to improve and support the Indigenous procurement process in true partnership. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Spadina Fort York.